on?
Dr. Javitt's here. How are you, sir?
It's great
to see you. You are in Southern California because of a number of things. But before we get to J.P. Morgan, because all of that, you and I were talking before the show, and we are in Carlsbad, California, which is in San Diego, but we broadcast everywhere. Here in Carlsbad, as you mentioned, there's what, 3 or 4 ketamine clinics. You can swing a dead cat and hit a ketamine clinic. And yet you are talking about opening up just that, or more than that, with Hope and NRx. Talk about the difference between what you're doing and what they're doing, and why that's so earth-shattering for us, because it's some pretty remarkable stuff you guys are accomplishing.
Well, yeah, the use of ketamine in depression, PTSD, was an incredible discovery. Yeah, as I told you, it started out in 1987 when my brother Dan discovered the role of the NMDA receptor in the brain and the role of phencyclidine angel dust in causing psychosis in people, making people mashugana.
I love that. Yeah.
And it turns out that phencyclidine blocks the NMDA receptor, and 10 years later, Rob Berman at Yale showed that if you block it a little more gently with ketamine, because phencyclidine is a dangerous drug, you actually decrease depression. And that's where that all started. So people jumped on the ketamine bandwagon because ketamine is the first drug ever to knock down depression and suicidality in a matter of hours. Now, it's not that durable. It lasts 3 to 5 days. It's addictive. It's hallucinogenic. But it changed the whole field of psychiatry forever. And a bunch of people who had really no business treating depression and suicidality with ketamine started opening clinics.
Okay.
A lot of these clinics are run by nurses, by people who are not prepared to really embrace precision psychiatry, but they know that people like the effect of ketamine.
Sure.
The problem is that ketamine's not enough. Ketamine gives you about a 50% effect, which is an extraordinary effect. Nobody's ever seen anything like that in psychiatry.
What is the effect specifically?
The effect specifically is that ketamine will decrease depressive thoughts and suicidal thoughts in a matter of hours. And that's never before been seen in psychiatry.
In about 50% of the cases, though. Is that what you're saying?
Well, a 50% effect.
Okay,
yeah.
a 50% effect. Okay, very good.
But to really get a durable effect, you've got to combine ketamine with other modalities of care. There's something called transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is a machine that sits outside the head, uses magnetism to achieve an antidepressive, anti-suicidal effect. The FDA just certified the first what they call digital therapeutic. It's actually an app that sits on your phone that has a therapeutic effect. So we don't talk about a ketamine clinic. We talk about interventional psychiatry, precision psychiatry, where you're combining those modalities in a manner that's really patient-centric and individualized.
So it's an enterprise-wide solution.
That's one way to look at it.
Do psychedelics factor into this as well? Because I know people talk about microdosing and psychedelics.
Psychedelics are brand new.
Okay.
So the reason we were able to do this work with ketamine is because ketamine's been approved as an anesthetic since the Vietnam War.
Oh.
It was actually developed by the Army. They needed an anesthetic that could be used on the battlefield that wouldn't make you stop breathing. Every other anesthetic, like Michael Jackson died of propofol. All those other anesthetics make you stop breathing. So unless you put a tube down the throat, they're dangerous. And they needed a battlefield anesthetic that wouldn't suppress breathing, and that's where ketamine came from. That's how it was invented.
Okay.
My question for you is going to be, and it's a question we've gotten from viewers before, is you've got NRx Pharmaceuticals, which by the way is a publicly traded company under the stock symbol NRXP. Then you've got Hope, which is a wholly owned sub or partially owned sub?
Well, Hope was a wholly owned sub until 2 weeks ago.
Okay.
And then we announced that Smith & Sauer, a wonderful family office that's been involved in the medical back office world for 20 years, came in and bought a third of Hope Therapeutics for $25 million.
Good. And
over time, the clinics we're acquiring are going to own stock in Hope. Other members of the investing community are going to buy stock in Hope. So NRx will own less and less of Hope, but Hope will get bigger and bigger. And we'd much rather own a hunk of a watermelon than all of a blueberry.
Sure, which is the way to think about it. So as a clinical stage biopharmaceutical company, NRx, what is the key goal there going forward? Is it to continue with drug development?
That's exactly right. Okay. NRx is going to continue drug development. We're applying for the new drug approval for ketamine first, and then NRx 101, our oral medicine that supplements the effect of ketamine. Second, we're looking at a really exciting opportunity that could be the first drug to actually cure schizophrenia in some patients. So every schizophrenia drug, and I learned about this disease when I was a college student. Every day on the way to organic chemistry at Princeton, I walked past this guy sitting on the bench in front of the Firestone Library with red sneakers, hair down to here, talking to people that I couldn't see, and his name was John Nash.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
And everybody saw A Beautiful Mind.
Yeah.
I walked past that man every day on the way to class. And the drugs that treat schizophrenia basically tamp down the brain. They're tranquilizers. That's why he preferred to be schizophrenic and live with the voices for 20 years until they finally invented a generation of drugs that enabled him to think and function while quieting the voices. But he openly said, when you listen to the interviews he gave, the voices never went away. The drugs helped him not have to listen to the voices.
Interesting.
So we're looking at an asset that could be the first drug that actually puts out the fire in the brain, that actually makes the voices not happen.
Oh, wow.
What is akathisia? You've brought it up before. Can you reignite that for us?
It's kind of a dirty secret of the pharmaceutical industry. It was described by a man named Lane at Pfizer in 1988, and it's a side effect of every known antidepressant on the market today, except for esketamine. All of the serotonin-targeted antidepressants have the potential to cause this side effect called akathisia, which is this horrible, irresistible need to move around. And the word comes from involuntary movement. But patients say they feel like they're jumping out of their skin. They can't focus their thoughts. They can't stay still. They can't function. There's a heartbreaking description from a woman whose husband was a very prominent Chicago lawyer, came home having just been given a new antidepressant by his doctor, antidepressant called Paxil, and couldn't stop tapping his feet under the table at dinner. And nobody could understand, why are you tapping your feet? And he didn't even know why he was tapping his feet.
Probably didn't know he was.
And the next day, witnesses saw him pacing up and down the subway station in Chicago, and before they knew it, he threw himself in front of a train.
Oh.
And it wound up as a huge class action lawsuit against the manufacturer of that drug. And it's one of the reasons that pharmaceutical companies have stopped developing new SSRI drugs, because all of those drugs, and they're the primary drugs for treating depression, they all have the potential to cause akathisia, and akathisia is very closely linked to suicide. So our drug NRx 101, to the best of our knowledge, is the first drug that's ever been shown to decrease akathisia in a clinical trial. Wow. There's a drug that was just approved, Caplyta, that was just bought by J&J, that people are excited about because it causes less akathisia than the other drugs in its class. But to the best of our knowledge, nobody's ever shown an actual decrease in akathisia by administering a drug combined with an antidepressant.
His name is Jonathan Javitt, NRx Pharmaceuticals. NRXP is a stock symbol, of course, Hope Therapeutics. Is Hope going to go public at some point? Is that the idea for that? It will be a separate sort of
we've told investors to expect that Hope will go public. My personal target, and I think I've said this in public, but you're a public forum, so I can say public things, is that we think Hope should probably stay private until it has $100 million in revenue. And we've said that we expect it to have about $100 million in revenue by this time next year.
Yeah, which is a pretty rapid rate. With respect to NRx pharmaceutical drug development, talk about the chronic pain thing. We don't ever talk about that much. Talk about your chronic pain. You have a really interesting chronic pain drug that I want to just.
Well, there's a story about chronic pain that is still not told, but our drugs, at least the drugs that we've already got moving towards FDA, affect something called the NMDA receptor in the brain. That's the one my brother discovered. That's where phencyclidine binds. That's where ketamine binds. And anesthesiologists have known for years that ketamine, which is a potent NMDA receptor antagonist, has an effect on pain. We've seen hints of effects on pain with oral NMDA antagonists. And I would bet that there's an oral drug to be developed. It may be NRx 101, We'd love to have
no
the
kidding.
funds to do a chronic pain study with
Is
NRx.
it, when you say chronic, is this back pain? Is this all pain? Is it criteria
This is
specific
the
to one type of pain?
This is the whole pain pathway. So, if you touch your finger to a hot stove,
Pain.
there are 3 nerve cells between your fingertip and the part of your brain that says don't ever do that again.
Okay.
There's one nerve cell that goes from your fingertip to the low level of your spinal cord, where that nerve enters the spinal cord. There's another nerve cell that goes up your spinal cord to sort of the reptile part of your brain. And then there's a third neuron that goes from the old brain, the reptile brain, to your modern, well, you might not have a modern thinking brain, but they do.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Every time. Every single time.
I saw the setup.
And so there's a third neuron, and each one of those neurons, when you pass a signal to the next nerve cell in the chain, it's called a synapse. Each one of those synapses is controlled by this NMDA receptor. So there's a reason to believe that drugs that affect the NMDA receptor can block the transmission of pain signals.
And that's where the connection with NRx 101.
Yeah, and in fact, ketamine's a dissociative anesthetic. The reason ketamine works as an anesthetic is not that it puts you to sleep, it's that it blocks your brain from recognizing that something painful is happening.
You know, I forgot to ask you when we were talking about suicidality, but also the bipolar effect that you'd mentioned in the past. Talk about that, because that's a big piece of NRx 101.
It is, and it's a big piece of suicidality. People who have what they call major depressive disorder, where their lives go from kind of okay to pretty sad, don't have that high a risk of suicide. It's sort of a 2 to 3-fold increased risk of suicide compared to people who aren't depressed. But people who have bipolar depression, those people who are like the brightest lights in the room, think Robin Williams, Anthony Bourdain, Kate
Right.
Spade, Margaret Kidder, everybody knows people like that. When they get depressed, it's lethal.
Really?
And there's reason to think that their depression is much more treatable with these anti-NMDA drugs than major depressive disorder. So one of the studies that we're incorporating in our FDA submission is a clinical trial that was done in France at 7 French psychiatric hospitals. And they looked at people who were hospitalized for suicidal depression and gave them ketamine versus placebo. The people with bipolar depression had a much larger effect than the people with major depressive disorder.
There's a buzzword going around in the media, and we get PRs sent to us to talk about it. We've never talked about it. It's called dopamine. Dopamine is a buzzword right now. It's the word that people are talking about, just like Oat Bran was back in the 80s. Where does dopamine fit in all of this, or does it?
Well, the brain, if you look at a computer, you've got electrical impulses that go between one semiconductor and the next. If you look in the human brain, a nerve cell doesn't send an electrical impulse to the next nerve cell. It sends a chemical signal to the next nerve cell. You don't have electrical connections.
Right.
You have electrical connections within the cell. The cell depolarizes, an electrical signal travels along the cell, but when it wants to influence the next cell in line, it sends out chemicals that influence the next cell in line, and also a lot of the cells around. That's why the brain is an analog computer, it's not a digital computer.
Okay.
And dopamine is one of those neurotransmitters. Now, how it fits into the treatment of depression, I can't tell you today. There's not a dopamine drug right now that's on the market in the same way that you've got NMDA drugs that are coming to the market and serotonin drugs. But dopamine is very much part of how your emotions are influenced within your brain. The other one to watch for is called oxytocin. Some people call it the love hormone.
Why did I hear? Yeah, I've heard this before. Oxytocin.
And a lot of people know about oxytocin because it's used to induce uterine contractions
That's what it is.
in labor.
That's what it was.
But
Oh, that was
oxytocin is
Pitocin.
also the reason that dogs and their owners love each other. So when people and dogs look into each other's eyes, each of them releases oxytocin.
Oh, no
They feel
kidding.
incredibly good. And
I feel better now that Jonathan's
one of the difference between, well, I know you're a dog lover, and
I am.
so am I. But one of the reasons, between that, people don't have that same reaction to looking into the eyes of a timber wolf is no oxytocin.
Different. Greg and I were talking about, when you came on last time, talking about Mar-A-Lago, right?
That's right. That's right. You conducted an investor workshop.
We had, a number of the members of Mar-A-Lago invited us to come and talk. And because so many members of the incoming administration have, openly said, you think they'd be talking about global security and other stuff, but so many members of the incoming administration have openly focused on the need to approve this next generation of what they call psychedelic drugs for treatment of depression and PTSD. And part of it is the suicide epidemic in the U.S. is just out of control.
Yeah.
Losing 22 vets and active duty every day. I fly for the U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary, and just a couple of weeks ago, the Commandant of the Coast Guard stood down the whole Coast Guard for 90 minutes of training on stress resilience and suicide prevention. Wow. And that's happening Army, Navy, Air Force. The CDC will tell you that 16 million Americans seriously thought about suicide in the last year. 3.6 million Americans made a plan. 1.6 million attempted suicide. And when you talk about these diseases that we've been fighting ever since we were human, we've bent the survival curve on cancer. I mean, my mother's brother died of childhood leukemia when he was 5 years old. You probably don't know anybody. You know people whose children have gotten leukemia, but you probably don't know anybody who's lost a child to leukemia recently.
Right.
It's been a huge success. Even breast cancer is now thought of as a chronic disease, not as a disease that's going to kill you in 6 months. We've not bent the survival curve on suicidal depression.
But it sounds like we're about to, potentially, with NRx.
Well, I hope we're going to do it. But not only us. J&J has brought out Spravato. We're not the only people who are going after this. But as a species, I predict that suicidal depression will be a much less lethal condition in 5 years.
Okay, before we let you go today, I want to talk about 2025 in as much as what you can talk about. I know you're a CEO of a public company, but you're also on a dual focus here between NRx and Hope. What are you looking forward to most with respect to each company going forward here for the next 12 months?
NRx has told its investors that it's developing 2 drugs. One is ketamine, and the first generation of ketamine is going to be a lot like the ketamine you can buy today, except it's not going to have a toxic preservative in it. That preservative was put in there because once upon a time they used to use the same vial in multiple patients, so you needed to be able to put a needle in a couple times and have it be sterile. Well, if you're using it in one patient, there's no reason to have a toxic preservative in there. So that'll be our first generation. But we've already talked about how ketamine can't be given into the skin right now because it's so acid. So our next generation with ketamine is going to be a pH neutral form of ketamine that could be put into something that looks like an insulin pump and given on a longer term basis. And I predict that before the year's out, we'll show people what our third generation of ketamine is going to look like, and that'll really excite people.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what the next is. I'm looking forward to having you come back in. Of course, you can watch the Bizumentary on suicidality and NRx, as well as Jonathan here on Biz TV, as well as in Bloomberg El Financiero. And I will tell you, there's going to be a more scientific version of it because I think there's a population that talks your language that needs to hear what you're talking about that are not like the rest of us. Always great to have you in studio, Dr. Jonathan Javitt, NRx Pharmaceuticals. NRXP is the ticker symbol, and of course, you can always go to our website and pick up his websites. So that's been Hope Therapeutics Incorporated and NRx Pharmaceuticals. Something to look at for the next several, and we'll get you back out here in the next couple of weeks, buddy. Good to see you.
That was fun.
There you go. Big Biz Show, more to come. Stand by.